please take your seats. Apologies, group 2, of which I am a member, and told you to go somewhere else. And I think I've thrown out another group. That's why I shouldn't be in charge of things. And unsurprisingly, Joel Butler doesn't know where to go. Oh, you're a group 2, see? Blind leading the blind sometimes. If you can see Brad Chapman waving over there with Craig, and Vanessa's on her way, that's group 2. That's an awkward minute while we wait. Yep, are we all in and streaming and stuff? Adventure in technology. Andrew, can I start? Oh, brilliant, I can see you up back there. Welcome, colleagues, back to another year at the school. One of the most energising things about our community of practice to me is that they are about growth, not just for students, but for us as professionals. Earlier this week, we were reminded that growth comes from both resilience and habits. Not habits as slogans or aspirations, but the small, consistent practices that shape what happens in our lives and in our classrooms every day. Communities of practice give us the space to examine these habits in our classrooms together and their alignment with evidence-informed practice. To test them, refine them, remove those that may no longer serve us, and embed those that genuinely make a difference for learning. This work can be accelerated when we hear from people whose thinking and expertise challenge us to focus on that last part. Those that genuinely make a difference for learning, and for us this term, the focus will be on assessment and its impact on student outcomes. Dylan Wiliam is Emeritus Professor of Educational Assessment at University College London. He began his career as a classroom teacher before moving into higher education and senior leadership. For the past 15 years, his work has focused on how assessment can be used to support learning in practical, classroom-based ways. He has worked with teachers across the world, and in fact, one of our colleagues in the room with us today has described him as having one of the most significant and enduring influences on their teaching, in particular, his ability to achieve student outcomes. At the heart of his message is a belief that aligns strongly with our work at the college, that every child learns every day, and that our collective responsibility is to create the conditions in which both students and teachers are supported to flourish. Please welcome me please join me in welcoming Dylan Wiliam.
Thank you. So I'll begin by sharing my screen, and I assume that you are recording this presentation. If not, please start doing that now. And I'll start by sharing my screen, and you will get access to the slides at the conclusion of this presentation. So, in the course of this presentation, in our time together, I want to convince you that formative assessment needs to be a priority. I want to spend some time actually clarifying exactly what assessment is, and then I'll spend some time on what formative assessment is and isn't. But the bulk of the time I will spend on the strategies and techniques of formative assessment. And in the next hour, I'm going to share with you about 25 different techniques for doing formative assessment. And if you try to use them all, you will fail. Your teaching will fall to pieces, and you'll just go back to doing what you feel safe with. So as you listen to my presentation, just think about which one or two, maximum 3 of these ideas you think you can begin to incorporate into your teaching this term. I'll conclude the presentation with some thoughts about how you can support your colleagues in developing their own work through what we call teacher learning communities These are specific kinds of communities of practice where full membership is restricted to people who are still teaching, and where the focus is on improving classroom practice. Okay, so why does formative assessment need to be a priority? Well, I think we all understand we need to improve student achievement for a whole range of reasons. And I think we should be using research to do that. But the research will never tell teachers what to do. Classrooms are far too complicated. So I think to use research intelligently, we have to ask ourselves some serious questions. I think there are some people who think that educational research is a waste of time. I think they're wrong. I think educational research can tell us things that don't work. We used to believe that teaching children in their preferred learning style would help them learn better, and now we know that's not true. So research can tell you things to avoid. It can also suggest when things will work and when they won't. But I think the crucial thing to using research intelligently is to interrogate the research. So the first one is, does it solve a problem we have? If you look at research on how to choose the best teachers when you select people to interview, that's relevant if you have more than one person applying for the job. But in many parts, particularly of rural Australia, it's hard enough to get one person to apply for the job. So that research doesn't actually solve the problem they have. They're not actually selecting, they're recruiting. So does it solve a problem you have? Another good example would be teacher content knowledge. That research is relevant if your teachers don't have a lot of content knowledge, but where teachers are knowledgeable, that research is pretty much irrelevant. You've solved that problem already. The second question, if we do this, how much faster will our students learn, is probably the most important. But the answers that we have aren't very satisfactory, because researchers tend to give you things like effect sizes. And actually, nobody understands effect sizes in education. They're meaningless because they don't compare adequately across studies. What I want to know when somebody says, here's a new idea, I want to know how much faster will our students learn? How much extra learning will we get per year? And if they can't tell me that, then I don't know what sense to make of that. If they give me an effect size, it might translate into practice, but most of the time it doesn't. And I think the last 20 years has shown that the effect sizes that researchers have claimed never translate into similar sized effects in classrooms. So I want to know how much faster will our students learn? And then what will be the cost? In money, sure, but more importantly, in terms of teacher time. I've now become convinced that opportunity cost is the single most important concept in educational improvement. Because every hour that teachers spend on one thing is an hour they don't have to spend on something else. And so we need to be careful about not saying, does it work, but how much does it work and how much time will it take? And I think teacher time is such a precious commodity. We need to be very careful. The fourth question, can we implement it here? So there's a big debate about whether class size reduction works. And some people have said that class size reduction doesn't work. Smaller classes aren't more effective. And they're wrong. They're just quite simply wrong. If you taught a smaller class, you'd get better results. The reason that the research is ambiguous is because when you reduce class size, you need more teachers. And as California discovered in the 1990s, where they reduced class sizes from 30 down to 20, they discovered they needed an extra 300,000 teachers, and they could only train 100,000 of them, so they gave emergency permits to teachers. 200,000 people were untrained and were given emergency teacher licenses, and it's not surprising, therefore, that it made things worse. The point is that the people in those districts could have told you how challenging teacher recruitment was. They could have told you it won't work here because teacher recruitment is challenging. And that's why, to use research, you need to be critical consumers of research. Does it solve a problem we have? Are we likely to get the results? Do we have the time to do it? And can we implement it here? When you look at those questions, you actually find there are two best bets right now. The first is curriculum development. There's now pretty good research that shows that with better curricula, students make more progress, up to 25% more progress. Here's the problem. We don't know in advance how to design more effective curricula. We can evaluate retrospectively this curriculum was better, but we aren't able to predict in advance. So now, if we decide to change the curriculum, we're pretty much gambling with our children's future because we have no idea whether this new curriculum is going to be better than the old ones. In other words, we don't know what to do. When we ask that fifth question, do we know what to do? Then classroom formative assessment turns out to be the most important thing to focus on. We know from large-scale randomized controlled trials that when teachers are supported in developing their classroom formative assessment practice, this is in secondary schools, one study looked at 140 secondary schools, and they looked at students in year 9 and year 10, and where the teachers were given support in developing formative assessment over years 9 and 10, the pupils, the students in those schools, made 25% more progress. The final question we need to look at, and we always need to be careful here, what side effects are possible or likely? So whenever people ask me about new reforms, I say, well, what will be better if we do what you say? And what will be worse if we do what you say? And if they say nothing in answer to the second question, they're not serious. There'll always be something that's worse. The question is the trade-off worth it? So to go into detail, I think we need to understand exactly what an assessment is. And I think the most helpful definition comes from the work of Lee Cronbach. And he suggested that an assessment is nothing more than a procedure for drawing conclusions. We give students things to do, we look at what they do, we draw conclusions. The conclusions could be about status. This student understands covalent bonding. It could be about this student will probably be successful in training to be a doctor. The conclusions could be about teaching. These students seem to have understood how to solve quadratic equations. Or it could be, this is what I need to do next with this class. Here's the important point. The conclusions can either be summative or formative. Summative and formative are not kinds of assessment. They are descriptions of the uses that we make of the information that we get. So the same assessment information can be used summatively or formatively. So for example, in some schools, they take the term's content, the 10 weeks of the term, and they decide what they're going to teach in that 10 weeks and designate at least 80% of the content as essential and 20% as desirable. At the end of week 8, the students get tested on the essential content because the priority in for the first 8 weeks are the 80% of essential content. At the end of week 8, the students do a test. That score is reported to parents. Here's your child's level of mastery on the essential content. So that's being used summatively, but the same information can also feed into teacher planning about what are we going to do in the last 2 weeks of the term. If the students on average score quite highly, we'll actually do more of the extension material, the 20% of desirable. But if the students do badly on the 80% essential material, the bulk of the last 2 weeks of that term will be spent on the things that the students missed that are essential for future progress. The same assessment can yield information that is used both summatively and formatively. That's crucial to understand in going forward. So some people say that formative assessment is the same thing as assessment for learning. I don't think that's helpful. Here's why. If I tell the students there's a test on Friday, some of the students will actually study for that test. Assessments can motivate students. So if I just announce the assessment, I'll get more learning from some students, even if I don't bother giving the assessment. If students actually take the assessment, then we get what psychologists call retrieval practice. I'll say more about that later. And that can actually improve their learning. Assessment can tell the teachers or the students, these are the things that you didn't master. But the important point is it becomes formative assessment when the information is actually used. So I would say that formative assessment is one kind of assessment for learning, one aspect of assessment for learning, which requires that the information is actually used in improving achievement. Another way of thinking about this, just really simple way, is just in terms of a principle about learning and an uncomfortable fact about the world. The principle comes from David Ausubel, an educational psychologist, who over 50 years ago now said, if I had to reduce all of educational psychology to just one principle, I would say this. The most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach accordingly. Start from where the students are. Obvious, isn't it? Except we don't do it. We say really foolish things to our students like, you should know this, you're in year 9. Well, in Queensland, how do you get into year 9? You basically start in year 8 and have a birthday. If you had a birthday, good, on you go. Our students are where they are. Wishing they were somewhere else doesn't help. But why is it so hard to find out where they are? Because of the uncomfortable fact about the world. Our students do not learn what we teach. If good teaching starts from where the students are, and students don't necessarily learn what we teach them, then we can see that assessment is at the heart of effective teaching. Assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning, because it is only through assessing that we can figure out whether our actions as teachers have been successful. Before I go any further, I want to just clarify what I mean by learning. And the definition I quite like, and a lot of people don't, comes from Paul Kirshner and his colleagues, who say that learning is a change in long-term memory. And people see that, say, well, it's more than memorization. Yes, it is. Because in psychology, long-term memory is the term to describe everything that you don't need to relearn how to do. So if you can ride a bicycle, it's in long-term memory. And the point that Paul Kirshner is making here, is that if we teach our students something they can do at the end of today's lesson, but can't do 3 weeks later, then we shouldn't call it learning. We should reserve the word learning for stuff that sticks. And this is important because I bet every single one of you has had the experience of teaching a lesson that goes brilliantly. And you check for understanding at the end of the lesson, and every student has got it. And yet 2 weeks later, you check on the thing again, and it's as if the men in black have come along with their neuralizers and erased every trace of the lesson from the students' memories. And they'll tell you, you didn't teach us this. Yes, I did. I've got it on video. But the fact is that not all learning sticks. Not all teaching sticks. And the important thing is, it's not about getting through the curriculum. It's about teaching in a way that sticks. We'll say more about that later. But we also need to check on the here and now. The fact that our students can do something here and now at the end of today's lesson doesn't mean they'll be able to do it in 6 weeks' time. But if they can't do something at the end of today's lesson, it's highly unlikely they'll be able to do it in 6 weeks' time. The idea is that you'll make better decisions about what to do next if you have better evidence about what's going on in your students' heads. Better evidence, better decisions, better learning. It's as simple as that. And by better evidence, I mean better in 2 ways. The first is deeper, asking questions that are worth asking. So rather than asking, would your weight be the same on the moon? Because most students get that right because they've seen pictures of astronauts bouncing over the moon's surface. A much better question is, would your mass be the same on the moon? Because most students get that wrong because they haven't understood the distinction between mass and weight. So it's first asking questions that are worth asking. And the second point is getting information from everybody in the class rather than just the confident, articulate students. So some people like using no hands up, and I think that's a good stepping stone. But the really important thing is, if we're going to make good decisions in our classrooms, we need evidence about everybody's achievement in that classroom right now. It's about inclusion. It's about saying to every student, you matter, you belong, I need to hear from you in order to make decisions that reflect everybody's learning needs. And when I watch classrooms around the world, what I see is teachers making decisions that suit the learning needs of the fastest learning students in the classroom. And that can't be equitable. We need our teaching to work for everybody. And that means getting evidence from everybody. Better evidence, better decisions, better learning. The way to think about it is to build plan B into plan A. There's a strange paradox at the heart of teaching. Every teacher I have ever met knows that no lesson plan survives the first contact with students. And yet most teachers plan their lessons as if they're going to go perfectly. So what I'm suggesting is, let's plan our lessons on the assumption that they might not go according to plan. Let's build plan B into plan A. Let's build a checkpoint into the lesson, and we'll check to see if the students are with us. And if they are, we go on. If they're not, we do something different. But the important point is that's part of the lesson plan. It's not something we have to scramble to make up as we go along when we suddenly discover the lesson didn't work as well as we hoped it would do. The real problem here, of course, is that these terms get used in different ways. And so some of you will remember the Gonski reports that push this idea of formative assessment. And really, I think that Gonski's idea about formative assessment was really just kind of any assessment before the big one. And I don't think it's a bad thing to be doing, but it's not the kind of formative assessment that makes a difference. So in order to be inclusive, I talk about long cycle, medium cycle, and short cycle formative assessment, characterized in terms of the span, the length of the cycle, and what gets formed by the formative assessment. So what the Gonski reports envisaged was a kind of long cycle formative assessment across a term or a teaching unit, typical cycle length of 4 weeks to 1 year. And really, this was about monitoring and curriculum alignment. And so the big idea here is, let's monitor the students, which students are making progress, which students are not. Let's do something to help the ones who aren't. And that's a great idea. Any well-run organization should be able to monitor its progress towards its goals. It's a disaster if you get to the end of year 8 and find those students are not ready for year 9 work. But the point is, we have a choice. We can either have an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff or a fence at the top. And what I'm saying is, finding out 6 weeks into the term that a lot of students are falling behind, in my view, is too late. So we need medium cycle formative assessment within and between teaching units, typical cycle length of 1 to 4 weeks, resulting in what Richard Stiggins calls student-involved assessment. Assessment becomes something we do with our students rather than to them. But the biggest impact comes when we do formative assessment within and between lessons, minute by minute and day by day. So people ask me, how often should we do formative assessment? Well, it's not so much every 6 to 10 weeks. It's more like every 6 to 10 minutes. The idea is we are constantly checking for understanding in the classroom. And of course, teachers have always done this, but they've done it in ways that are really quite weak. So they say things like, everyone okay with that? Or use the thinking thumbs, yes or no. Give yourselves a traffic light, green if you understand, yellow if you're not so sure, red if you don't understand. The problem is they're self-reports. And we have 70 years of research on self-reports that show they can't be trusted. My favorite example of this is that 93% of American drivers think they're better than average. They can't all be right, can they? Now, we used to think that the reason for this was because people did not want to admit that they couldn't drive well. That's part of it. But research by 2 American psychologists, David Dunning and Justin Kruger, has shown that there's something else going on here. They found that when they gave their students a test and asked the students to rank their place in the class on the test, the students who were actually in the bottom 25% of achievement believed they were above average. This is now known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. The less you know about something, the more likely you are to overstate your knowledge. As David Dunning himself says, rule 1 of Dunning-Kruger Club is you don't know you're in Dunning-Kruger Club. And that's why 93% of American car drivers think they're above average. Most of them don't know enough about good car driving to know they're not very good. And that's why I don't like this idea of giving students chances to say, are you okay with that? They don't know that they're not okay with that. We need to move towards a pedagogy of engagement and a pedagogy of responsiveness where we get evidence from our students about what's going on in their heads. So here's an example. A teacher was wrapping up how to balance chemical equations, and she chose to use quite a tricky one here, which is mercury hydroxide and phosphoric acid. And she chose this one because the quantities of the compounds needed to balance the equation were larger than they'd seen in the previous examples they'd seen. And so she invited students to come up to the front and change the quantities of the compounds. And when nobody wanted to change anything, the teacher then said, "Is that now correct?" And every student had to vote yes or no. You see how different that is? Because now there's no place to hide. If it's not balanced and you vote yes, you've just proved to the teacher you've no idea what you're talking about. But if you vote no, you know what's going to happen, don't you? The teacher's going to ask you to come up to the front and fix the mistake. This is a pedagogy of engagement, putting every student on the spot, and a pedagogy of responsiveness, using that information to adjust your teaching in real time to better meet your students' learning needs. To put this into practice, we need to dig a bit deeper. So I think it's helpful to start with 3 strategies: where the learner is going, where they are right now, how to get there. And the role of the teacher, the learner, and their peers gives us 9 cells, which I think we can group together in this way. The first is clarifying, sharing, and understanding learning intentions and criteria for success, possibly the most widely implemented, but often the least well done of all the strategies. In many schools now, there is a policy that every lesson must begin with a learning intention, written by the teacher on the board, copied by the students into the notebooks, and then subsequently ignored for the rest of the lesson. But it's okay. If a member of senior leadership walks by, you are safe. There is a learning intention up on the wall. Some people call these wallpaper learning intentions. Now, I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea, but I don't know of a single research study done in primary or secondary schools that shows that having students write down the learning intention at the beginning of the lesson has any impact on their learning. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to do, I just don't see the benefit of it. And also, there are other ways that are much better to start a lesson, like write down everything you can remember about photosynthesis. This is called activating prior knowledge. And it turns out that if you want students learning to stick, then one of the things you can do is to get them to activate what they already know about this. So in Barak Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction, activating prior knowledge is one of the key ideas here. If students have been asked to think about the stuff they knew previously, then new content is more likely to stick. You might start off a lesson. I saw this example in I think it was a year 8 science class. The teacher began the lesson by asking the students, why does it take longer to cook potatoes at 220 degrees Celsius in an oven than it does at 100 degrees Celsius in a pan of boiling water? I thought, what a great question. The teacher had a clear learning intention in mind, but he judged that the best way to start the lesson was with a big question, what the Japanese call a hatsumon, a big question to organize students' thinking. Second strategy is eliciting evidence, not just questioning, but all the ways we find out where students are in their learning. And then providing feedback that moves learners forward. Now, why do we frame it like that? Well, back in 1998, Paul Black and I wrote a booklet called Inside the Black Box, and in it we suggested to teachers that feedback was generally more helpful in the form of comments rather than scores or grades. And to their credit, many teachers followed that advice. Unfortunately, a lot of the comments weren't that helpful. They were along the lines of, this would have been a better piece of work had you done the following things. But you didn't, so it isn't. When people see the word feedback, they fixate on the last 4 letters, B-A-C-K, and they think that feedback should be backward-looking. Feedback is not the view through the rear-view mirror. It's the view through the windscreen. Or as Douglas Reeves once pointed out, it's like the difference between getting a medical and a post-mortem. And many of our students get post-mortems rather than medicals. And the reason that happens is because we actually, I think, get the purpose of feedback wrong. Because we tend to think that the purpose of feedback is improving the work. And it's not. The goal of feedback is to improve the learner. And that's why AI struggles to be helpful in the classroom. Because AI wants to help you get a higher score for that piece of work. And so we do see AI helping students produce better work, but when they have to do things without the AI, they do worse. So let's focus on the purpose of feedback as improving the learner, not improving the work. The last 2 strategies underscore the fact that, as Richard Stiggins has pointed out, The most important decisions taken in classrooms are not taken by teachers, they're taken by students. Doesn't matter how good your feedback is, if your students have no desire to learn, you're wasting your time. We have to activate students as learning resources for one another and as owners of their own learning. And in many ways, this last strategy is the most important. It's where all the others lead. Let me illustrate. I'm often asked to observe teachers teaching a lesson. And if I watch a teacher teach a lesson, I can pretty much guarantee the first question that teacher will ask me is, how did I go? To which I now say, well, how do you think you did? I'm not doing that to avoid the question. I'm doing that because if that teacher can give me a good answer, my work here is done. That teacher knows what she needs to do to improve. She's well on the way to becoming, in the psychological jargon, a self-regulating learner. So these 5 strategies together pull all these ideas together. The idea is we help our learners become able to look after their own learning. There'll always be a goal or a need for feedback. But if we think of the main purpose of feedback as working towards its own redundancy, I think we'll get it right more often than not. One last thing, some people prefer the term responsive teaching or adaptive teaching. The reason I don't use that term is because it's just 2/5 of formative assessment. There's also the learner's role, and we also need to be clear about what it is we want to be teaching. So formative assessment does not tell you what to teach or how to teach or what happens when learning takes place. It's just a recognition that when we teach, the sense our students make of what we're teaching is unpredictable, and we'll make better decisions if we have better evidence. So in a minute, I'll start with some practical strategies and techniques, but I just want to give you a chance now to reflect on what you've heard so far, and in particular, to structure your reflection, think about what's the most interesting, surprising, or challenging thing you've heard so far. What's the most interesting, surprising, or challenging thing you've heard so far? Okay, so let's come back. So now I want to spend some time talking about learning intentions, and I said that they weren't very useful, but they can be, and here's why. So the starting point here is that I think that teaching should be an intentional activity. I don't want teachers walking into a classroom and saying, oh, look, some students, what shall I do with them? So as long as we think of teaching as an intentional activity, then learning intentions are what you want your students to get better at as a result of spending some time in the classroom with you. Those are the learning intentions. But you can't judge learning in the lesson because the learning hasn't happened yet. Learning is that gradual strengthening of connections in the mind that takes place over a matter of weeks. That's where success criteria come in. Success criteria are descriptions of task performance. I'll be happy if, by the end of today's lesson, every student can factor quadratic expressions with unitary quadratic coefficients. Some students will go further, but that's your basic deal breaker. I'll be happy if. So here's the really important point. Learning intentions are not useful to students. Learning intentions are useful to teachers for planning teaching. Oh, and by the way, they should come before you plan the lesson. Too often I see teachers tagging on the learning intentions after they've planned the lesson. No, first decide what you want your students to get better at, and then figure out what kinds of activities are going to help them get better at that, and then develop some success criteria so that you and your students can evaluate whether the lesson went according to plan. I'll be happy if by the end of the lesson, every student can do this. Doesn't guarantee it'll stick, but you'll make better decisions because you know what you're looking for in the lesson. So there could be limitations on what is expected in the quadratic example I just gave. There could be practice in applying in different contexts. We've been studying flooding in Bangladesh. But why Bangladesh? You're not particularly interested in Bangladesh. You're interested in physical geography. And so therefore, the success criterion might be, can they apply what they've learned to flooding in the Nile in Egypt, for example, or the Mississippi in Louisiana? They can be descriptions to students of what is meant. But there's a real problem here because often we use language that is meaningful to us, but not to our students. I was in a classroom with a year 10 class a while back. This girl called me over. And it was a literature lesson. And she said, I don't know what the teacher wants. So what's the problem? She said, well, to get the top grade, my writing has to be sustained and concise. I said, yeah. She said, well, sustained means long and concise means short. What does the teacher want? To the expert, there's no conflict between those two terms. But to the novice, there was. So we need to be clear that we're not using language that our students don't yet understand. The problem then, of course, is we go too far the other way and we scaffold the students' responses with, for example, a checklist. Common in science, for example, with a laboratory report. And I'm absolutely in favor of this. But here's the issue. If you have a checklist for what needs to be there in a laboratory report, and students are still relying on that checklist after 2 years, I question, are you improving the learner or are you improving the work? So there's a tension here between over-scaffolding, so the students don't have to do any thinking, they just jump through the hoops that you've told them to jump through. But at the other extreme, we are being too vague and it doesn't mean to the students what it means to you because they're not yet experts. So, practical techniques. Share learning intentions and success criteria when appropriate, but not necessarily at the beginning, and maybe not at all in the lesson. Start with examples rather than rubrics. But don't make this process of so-called co-construction a negotiation. So some teachers give students some examples, and then the class discuss what's good about the good ones. And they call that process co-construction. And I have no problem with the term, provided the negotiations are rigged. The fox does not get to guard the henhouse. The lunatics do not get to run the asylum. And the students do not get to decide what counts as quality work. They don't know. They are students. You are the expert. So by all means, use co-construction as a pedagogical device to get students to understand where the criteria came from, but you need to be in charge. So you mustn't delegate responsibility for quality to the students. That's an abdication of responsibility. And don't mix up the things you care about with the things you don't care about. So ChatGPT is quite good at producing examples of different levels of quality. I tried it the other day. I asked it to produce 4 different 200-word essays on the causes of the First World War. at different levels of quality. And it did that. Unfortunately, like most teachers, it made the best one the longest one. And so a lot of students would just pick the longest one because they think that's the best. So don't mix up length with quality. Make sure that sometimes the best answer is the shortest, because then you're getting students to focus on the quality. We often give students clues. We talk about flipping fractions in maths, and I'm very happy with that in year 5. I think by the time they're in year 8, we should be talking about reciprocals. We don't help our students by sticking with the baby talk. They need to develop the language of the discipline, so we have to reduce the use of student-friendly language and focus on the language of the discipline. Use planning and writing frames judiciously. They're meant to be a guideline, not a straitjacket. So a nice example, in a year 7 class, a teacher got students to read some suspense stories, and in discussion they agreed that the good suspense stories had establishing the characters, a period of rising tension, a climax, and a resolution. And so that week's task was to write a suspense story. The following week, the teacher began the lesson by showing a clip from an American TV show, one of those crime dramas. And it was one of those episodes that starts with a hero getting into some trouble, and the action freezes, and up comes the caption, 6 hours earlier. And what the teacher pointed out is the director was deliberately playing with the standard structure by starting with the climax. And so that week's task was, write a suspense story that breaks the rules. And to be honest, the students struggled, but I thought it was a really nice attempt by the teacher to show that sometimes these structures help us do better work, but sometimes you do better work by ignoring the structures or by deliberately breaking the rules. Assessing your own work is cognitively demanding and emotionally challenging. So a good starting point here is have students assess the work of anonymous others. So you give them a rubric, for example, and you give them some student work, anonymous, and you say to them, what grade or level would you give this piece of work? And what feedback would you give to that student? The reason that's powerful is because it forces them to internalize the rubric in the context of a less emotionally charged piece of work. And therefore, they learn what the rubric is about and then apply it at a separate time. So you're splitting up the process of learning the rubric from applying it to their own work. And finally, it's been shown that asking students to design test questions with correct answers about what they've been studying actually improves their learning. So yes, you've heard about retrieval practice. I'll say more about that in a minute. But it's also powerful if we just get students to design their own test questions about this topic they've been studying. One final example, Paul Spenceley is a science teacher who we worked with 20 years ago, and he spent 20 years then in the classroom perfecting his formative assessment practice. And he's become convinced that things like learning intentions of this kind aren't helpful. Students don't know whether they can do that or not. So his argument is the best way to get good success criteria is to make them such that students can use it to assess their own work. I can do this if I can state 3 adaptations that polar bears have survive. How does each adaptation help them survive? Rather than saying, we're learning about photosynthesis, I will be successful if I can state the 2 reactants and the 2 products of photosynthesis. So eliciting evidence, the big idea here is that questioning should cause thinking or give you data on a student's understanding of something that informs your teaching. I think those are the only 2 good reasons to ask a question. The best starting point here, one teacher said to me, you can't think up good questions on your own. You'll always be victim to your own way of thinking about this stuff. So find time to plan questions with your colleagues. That's one of the best uses of collaborative time with your colleagues. Not lesson planning so much. What are good questions we can use to find out if students have really understood this topic? People worry about closed versus open questions, but I don't think it's an issue. There are some great closed questions. Which way does light travel, from my eye to what I'm seeing, or from what I'm seeing to my eye? Many secondary school students believe that light radiates out from the eye. So if you know a misconception that students might have, Address it straight on with a closed question. Closed questions can also cause thinking. Is a square a trapezium? Most students have never thought about that, so they have to think about it. And so the important point is not whether it's closed or open, it's whether it causes them to think or just regurgitate facts. Low order versus high order. And the evidence is teachers ask about 5 times as many low order questions as high order questions. And I don't know what the right balance is, but 5-1 seems to me a bit skewed towards the lower order. And if you've asked them a higher order question, give them time to think. If you've given them a thinking question, give them time to think, but only if it's a thinking question. Let's face it. If the students don't know the capital of Sweden, extra time isn't going to help. So no point in giving wait time if it's a factual recall question. If it's a thinking question, give them time to think. No hands up, except to ask a question. And again, I'm going to focus on this thing about inclusion. So people think that picking on students who've not raised their hands is scary, and maybe is for a couple of weeks, but students get used to it very quickly. But here's the important message. I'm not picking on you because you weren't paying attention. I'm not picking on you because I want to have a go at you. I'm asking you for a response because I need to hear what you think about this issue. You belong to this classroom. You are a full member, and I can't make a good decision about what to do next without hearing from you. And so this idea of no hands up, it's nothing more than inviting a response from a student who has not indicated they want to make a response. It could be to a question you've asked. It could be to a response that another student has made. But the idea is we stress participation. We can give students a chance to opt out. Madeline Hunter many years ago suggested allowing students to hold their pen pointing upwards to signal, don't call on me for this question, which is fine. But if the pen is still pointing upwards after 20 minutes, you might want to challenge the student. It's not meant to be scary. It's about basically inclusion. And so telling every student they belong. And then universal response systems, getting a response from every member of the class. You can buy these expensive so-called classroom clickers. And the people who sell these classroom clickers say, the great thing is you can record every single student response. Yeah. That does not sound like a plus to me. The idea that every single wrong answer I have ever given in a classroom is recorded in an Excel spreadsheet until the end of time sounds distinctly creepy to me, as if George Orwell's 1984 has finally arrived. If we want to create a classroom where students feel okay with making mistakes, the last thing we should do is record every single one of them. And that's why I like mini whiteboards. I think mini whiteboards are the most important development in educational technology since the slate. Every teacher can do this very quickly with low tech. The important point is we are concerned to get a response from everybody so we can make better decisions. And the questions you ask really matter here. So there's this question that I really like, but it's not a great question for diagnosis, because every one of these responses could be correct depending on the assumptions you make. And teachers say, yeah, I would just get every student to explain their answer. No, you won't. No teacher in the history of teaching has ever got every student in a class to explain their answer, because by the time the class has heard from 10 students, everyone, including the teacher, is losing the will to live. So these questions are great if you want to spend 20 minutes on the discussion. They are no good as checks on understanding. If students have to explain their answers, they can't be used as checks for understanding. What I'm talking about is what I call diagnostic questioning. So a response from every student, like this classroom in the foothills of the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. What I love about this picture is that the teacher is getting a response from every student, and none of the slates match. But this teacher, who's probably not even been trained, let alone been on any professional development courses, she gets the idea. The best teachers were doing this 200 years ago. A response from every student, a quick check on understanding, not a discussion. And the idea here is you're simply deciding, what do I do next? It's not data-driven decision-making, it's decision-driven data collection. I'm not going to record these students' answers because I just want to make a decision. The best formative assessment often leaves no written evidence. It's just a smarter decision by the teacher about what to do next. The most important thing is that the right response means the right thinking. If the right answer is in front of us, we can pretty much guarantee the students have the right thinking. And that's where the design of the questions really matters. There's two main approaches. One is distractor-driven multiple choice questions. So in a multiple choice question, different choices are called options. The correct option is called the key. The other options are called distractors. And the idea is we put in wrong answers that are related to well-known misconceptions to make it A, less likely that the students get it right by guesswork, and B, more importantly, if they get it wrong, you know why they got it wrong. So here's a nice example from Jonathan Osborne. What I love about this question, well, two things really. One is it's multiple choice, and yet it assesses a higher order skill to do with measurement. But what I really like about this question is that it builds in a lot of the misconceptions we know that children have about measurement. A lot of these wrong answers look really plausible. So that's the big idea here. Have a right answer and lots of wrong answers that will be chosen by students whose understanding is limited or insecure. A group of English teachers in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, were doing persuasive writing. Here's their multiple choice question on which of these is the best thesis statement. And I like this question because there's lots of opinion statements here, but I think most English teachers would agree that within the genre of persuasive writing, D, the amount of violence on TV should be reduced, is the best thesis statement. And the one that drives English teachers crazy is, of course, B, the essay I'm going to write is about violence on TV. Here's one from a Spanish classroom. Native English speakers have two difficulties with Spanish pronouns. One is which one do you use, where does it go? In some of these, you've got the right pronoun in the wrong place, and some you've got the wrong pronoun in the right place. In one of these, you've got the wrong pronoun in the wrong place, and in just one of these, you've got the right pronoun in the right place. This was developed by teachers in Chico, California. It took them 75 minutes. That's a long time. But that will be a good question in 20 years' time. And it works just as well in Australia as it does in California, because native English speakers have the same difficulty with Spanish pronouns. I use these in my master's teaching. So this is a question that I use in my Psychology of Learning master's module. I assign reading, and the way I make sure that the students do the reading is that they know that at the beginning of the next session, the following week, I will begin the session with a question like this, which addresses the main point of the chapter I assigned to read. And I'll do finger voting, 1 for A, 2 for B, 3 for C, 4 for D. The fact that the students know they're going to be assessed on the reading at the beginning of the next session makes them do the reading. And I think this is going to be very important when students have unlimited access to AI at home. We have to stop assessing the work that students bring back, and we have to start assessing what's in their heads. And one way to do that is to assign work, but then start the lesson with a quick question that assesses whether they did the work well when they were outside the classroom. And just for completeness, this is from my PhD teaching on research methods, just to show that these kinds of questions can go all the way up to postgraduate level, this idea of distractor-driven questions. The other approach is to have multiple correct questions, multiple correct answers. So here's a maths question, typical, I guess, year 7. What's the area of the semicircle? Forgive me for missing out the units. Hopefully the students can get 50 pi, C, but the point is that there's more than one correct answer here. And so one of the ways we can actually provide stretch and challenge is by having multiple correct responses at different levels of difficulty. Nothing is going to make a gifted student pay more attention next lesson than you whispering in their ear as they leave the classroom, "You missed one." So basically this idea of the checkpoint I mentioned earlier, the lesson hinges around this point. The idea we ask a question at the hinge. Students must respond within 2 minutes, ideally less than half that, and you collect and interpret the responses, and most students in 30 seconds. Feedback, there's lots that teachers are told about feedback. Should be timely, should be positive, it should be constructive, whatever. The trouble is that the research on feedback doesn't support such simplistic conclusions. There's a classic study by Kluger and Denisi. They reviewed 3,000 research reports. They went back to 1905. They then excluded the badly designed studies. They were left with just 131 well-designed studies involving about 12,500 individuals. And on average, feedback did increase achievement, but the effect sizes varied a lot. And in one of the most counterintuitive results in all of psychology, they found that in 38% of the studies, giving people feedback made their performance worse. And when I ask teachers, they always get the reason why. It's how students react to feedback. So people say, well, what's the effect size of feedback? And I'm saying it's meaningless, because you might get a high effect size for feedback by having the students becoming dependent on the feedback. So we need to look at what feedback does to our students. And the students can do 4 things with feedback. They can change their behavior, they can change the goal, they can abandon the goal, or they can reject the feedback. Which of these is good and which of these is bad depends on the context. So if the feedback shows they're falling short of the goal, we want our students to change behavior because we want them to increase effort. But we don't want them to change behavior if they've reached the goal, because we don't want them to exert less effort. We'd like them to aspire to a higher goal. We want them to change the goal. But we don't want students doing that if they're falling short of the goal they've got. I was going for an A, I'll settle for a B. The last 2 are always bad. Abandon the goal, maths is stupid, or reject the feedback. My maths teacher is stupid. And here's why feedback is so hard to get right. When you give students feedback, 8 things can happen. 6 of them are bad. And what makes the difference? What makes feedback work? Well, it's uncomfortable and obvious. Relationships. Every teacher knows the same feedback given to one student will make that student try harder, and to a very similar student will make that other student give up. So we have to know our students, know when to push, know when to back off, and our students need to believe in us. That A, we know what we're talking about, and B, that we have their best interests at heart. And so that's the challenge. It turns out that people believe that feedback should be immediate, but for older students, delayed feedback can be more effective than immediate feedback. We're told that feedback should be specific, but if feedback is too specific, it's just telling the students how to get a higher score. What we want is feedback that helps them do a better job at some point in the future on a task they have not yet attempted. Is the goal improving the learner or improving the work? Specific feedback tends to improve the work, not improve the learner. So ultimately, it comes down to a very simple thing. The purpose of feedback is to improve the student, not the work. The only thing that matters with feedback is what students do with it. And if your feedback is getting you more of what you want, it's good feedback. The only good feedback is that which gets you more of what you want from your students. And as a way of doing that, I think as a general principle, I like to try to ensure that feedback should be more work for the recipient than the donor. So, practical techniques for feedback. First, cause thinking. Good feedback causes thinking, at least in academic subjects. Not necessarily in sport, but in the academic side, if the feedback causes students to think, then it's more likely to be effective than a feedback that causes emotional reactions. I recommended to schools that they do what I call 4 quarters marking. I don't think it's healthy for teachers to mark everything that their students do. It's not bad, it's just not a very good use of teacher time. So I think parents should understand you can expect your child to get detailed feedback on 25% of the work that they do. And then we'll make sure that they react to it. So I'm saying, if it's worth your while writing detailed comments on a piece of students' work, it's worthwhile taking class time for them to respond to that feedback in class. So if you're writing comments on students' work, the first 5 minutes when they're back in the classroom with you should be them responding to that feedback, because otherwise it's only the keen students who respond to the feedback and the achievement gap gets bigger. 25% whole class feedback. You take in all the books and look at, what do I need to do again with the whole class? 25% peer assessment, 25% self-assessment. I'm not going to go to the stake on these percentages, but the idea is there's lots of different ways of giving feedback. Marking individual students' work is just one of them. It's worth doing, but very quickly you get diminishing returns. Comment-only marking, of course, yes, but how do you get students to read the comments? Charlotte Kerrigan, an English teacher, found a way. She wrote her comments on a Shakespeare essay her students had written on strips of paper, and each group of 4 students got back their 4 essays and the 4 strips of paper, and their task was match the comments to the essays. A really good way of slowing down that ego reaction. Focus marking. Some schools have policies that everything that's wrong must be corrected. It just bruises the egos of the students and it just doesn't help. So focus marking, give them feedback on the things that they need to work on immediately. That's a very strong message from sports coaching. It's called bandwidth feedback. If you give students too much feedback, it's just not prioritized and they won't do anything with it. If you do give students a mark scheme or a scoring guide or a rubric, make sure you refer back to that in the feedback. Many people don't close that loop. Maths teachers said to us, this is all very well for English teachers and history teachers, but you can't do this in maths. Because if you tick 15 of these equations correct and put a cross next to 5 others, the students can figure out for themselves they got 15 out of 20, whether you tell them or not. He said, fair enough, just tell them. 5 of these are wrong. You find them, you fix them. So let's think about that for a minute. Charlotte Kerrigan's approach, match the comments to the essays. The maths teachers are a line of 5 of these are wrong, you find them, you fix them. What's the common thread here? A shift from feedback as information to feedback as detective work. So rather than saying, you need to add more factual details to support your argument in your 3rd paragraph, surely, if the students are really working well, they should be able to figure out which paragraph is lacking factual details. Can you figure out which one and supply the missing details? Ensure you use BIDMAS throughout your calculations. And I assume you use BIDMAS rather than PEMDAS, but rather than saying you haven't, ensure you use BIDMAS throughout your calculations, what I call feedback as nagging. How about in 3 of these calculations, you haven't used BIDMAS correctly. See if you can find them and fix them. When writing in German, remember to use the correct grammatical gender, more nagging. How about in the 2nd paragraph, you've used the incorrect grammatical gender for the in 3 places. Please find them and fix them. You need to use specialist terminology. Ensure you monitor this right, blah, 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 blah. More nagging. How about there are at least 5 places in these answers where it'd be much better to use specialist terminology. I've highlighted 2 of them. Scaffolding. Please redraft using the appropriate language in the other 3. The idea is that good feedback provides support and challenge in equal measure. Okay, so the last 2 strategies I'm going to go over quickly, and if you want to have more details about this, then please pick that up in the questions. Students as resources for one another. The crucial thing with all collaborative and cooperative learning is we need 2 things. We need group goals and we need individual accountability. Too often we set collaborative tasks to a group in a way that allows 2 or 3 students to do the work for the whole group. But you see, in team sport, we get these 2 essential components. One person missing a tackle in a rugby game harms the whole team's chances of winning, group goals, and everybody knows who missed the tackle. In the orchestra, one person playing a wrong note because they didn't practice harms the whole performance, group goals, and everyone knows who played the wrong note, individual accountability. So what we have to figure out, if we want to use peer learning and peer tutoring, is we have to build in accountability. The idea is that students are accountable for the quality of support they give each other. So one would be peer-mediated feedback. I give feedback to a piece of students' work, but then a peer has to help them make sense of that, so it slows down the ego involvement. I mentioned earlier the value of anonymous work as a stepping stone. So I think if you want students to self-assess, start with assessment of anonymous peers, then actual peers, then own work. The other thing is, we know that adults aren't very good at giving feedback, so why should we expect secondary school students to be any good? So borrowing a line from the Harvard Business School, where they developed this idea of a ladder of feedback for use in the business world, clarify. I wasn't sure what you meant by this. Value, I like this. I had a concern about this, and I'd like to suggest this. So by giving students a clear protocol for step-by-step work, for giving feedback in this particularly four-stage way, it makes it much more likely it's going to be accepted by the student who receives it and helps students structure it more effectively. So, pre-flight checklist. Before I can hand in my laboratory report, my partner has to check that all the things that should be there are there. And if they say it's okay, they sign off on it and I can hand it in. But here's the important point. If something that my partner said was okay isn't okay, who does the teacher have a go at? My partner, because she let me down. So the idea is we make students accountable for their support. 2 stars and a wish, I like that, I wish you'd done that. How do you make the accountability work? Collect in the wishes and lead a whole class discussion about the wishes. These are anonymous, but students have told us. The fact that they knew the whole class was going to be discussing this work, this comment, even though it was anonymous, made them take it more seriously. Choose, swap, choose works well when students make multiple attempts at the same task. There's a permanent record of the attempt, and there's some subjectivity in the assessment. So I draw the same Japanese character 10 times. I choose my best one. My partner does the same for his. We swap. I choose my partner's best rendition of the character. If we disagree, we talk about why. We can go through this in different subjects, all different ways of doing choose. Group questions. Rather than saying, does anybody have any questions? We say, I want one question from each group. And then finally, having students summarize the lesson. And then when students are preparing for exams or tests, best composite response. Students do tests on their own under test conditions, but then we take in the answers and don't mark them ourselves. We give them back to the students the next day with a blank answer sheet, and their task as a group, construct the best composite response you can. And because of the Dunning-Kruger effect, some students may mislead others, so you do need to do a plenary discussion, but the idea is we have all the students taking each other's learning seriously. I'll just take a break there because we have one more strategy to deal with, which is students as owners of their own learning. But I do want to give you a chance to ask questions first. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to hand over to, I think we're using Slido.
Hi, Dylan. Rach and Sarah here at the front. We've got some questions that our wonderful teachers have been sharing, so we'll just share a few of them with you now. The first is, what's the optimal size of the class, number of students to achieve the best result in formative assessment? So what's the ratio? One teacher to what number of students?
Well, I think that has no answer. So I do formative assessment when I do lectures at the University of London's Institute of Education, and I lecture 1,000 students at a time. So there's 1,000 students, and I get them to use finger voting. So, you know, it's the smaller the better, down to about 15, 20, I would say. But don't forget that reducing class size costs the same, say from 30 to 20, as giving every teacher a 50% pay rise or a sabbatical every 3 years.
That's a good way to put it. Thank you, Dylan.
Or 30% non-contact time. So
They're very good
I think
points.
there's no answer to that question. Class size reduction is, in my view, not a good use of the money. I think we'd be better off using the extra resources to give teachers more preparation time and maybe more thinking time, rather than saying it's got to be this or that.
Thanks, Dylan. Next question. Do you have a view on whether written or verbal feedback is more effective in improving the learner?
We've looked at that, and we can't find any research that answers that question definitively. Obviously, if the students can't read, then written feedback is not that useful. The good thing about written feedback is it's not ephemeral. It's there for the students to look at afterwards. So, I think there's benefit in written feedback, but there's also, the immediacy of oral feedback is very useful. One of the problems with oral feedback, of course, is that there's no evidence of it. So one of the things I suggest is that when you give students oral feedback, the students go back to their seats, for example, and they write down what it is that you said and what they're going to do with that feedback. It has three benefits. First, it develops literacy skills. Second, it creates a reminder for the student about what that interaction was all about. But thirdly, and most importantly, it creates a mnemonic. It proves that you've been doing your feedback work. So I think that we can do ephemeral feedback and make it permanent without worrying too much about documenting it effectively. I know that some people are more worried about proving they've been giving feedback. Schools in England had this ridiculous idea of a rubber stamp that said oral feedback given. And I just think that's just crazy. Teachers spending time proving they've been doing the thing rather than doing the thing.
Dylan, as you've been speaking, there have been loads of comments about your presentation coming in. I'll share one of them, and it's, I like the analogy of the windscreen and not the rearview mirror, and the importance of changing the student or the learner and not the work.
Yeah, great. Well, yes, that is, I think that is my kind of summary of all the research that I have found, really. It's just so common to find the feedback focusing on increasing the mark or the score or the grade. And so, yeah, improving the learner. And as I said earlier, it's why I think AI is going to struggle. AI wants to help you. AI wants to get you a better score for that piece of work, and it'll do the thinking. Here's a very nice analogy that Paul Kirshner has used. The question when we use AI is it cognitive offloading or is it cognitive outsourcing? So cognitive offloading is when we actually, in mathematics, for example, when we're doing a calculation, like adding up 2-3-digit numbers, we make marks on a piece of paper, and that amplifies the power of our brains because we're kind of offloading some of the work to the piece of paper that stays in our visual field. That's cognitive offloading. We are still doing the thinking, but we're doing it in an enhanced way. Most of what I see happening is cognitive outsourcing. We're having the AI doing the thinking for us. That means that we don't do the learning. Because as Daniel Wiliam has pointed out, memory is the residue of thought. Students remember what they've been thinking about. The analogy I like to use is for a lot of students, getting the AI to do the work is a bit like taking a robot with you to the gym and have the robot lift the weights. It's not going to make you stronger.
Great thoughts there, Dylan. We have another question. When can feedback become overused?
Well, I think one obvious one is when it does the thinking for the students. So when it improves the work rather than improving the learner. And it makes the students more dependent on the feedback. So, a positive effect size may not be good news. Some of our students are much needier than others. So some students just need a hint and they're away. Other students need supporting. So sometimes we just need to reduce students' dependence on feedback. And ultimately, as I said, it comes down to relationships, knowing when to push, knowing when to back off. And certainly in a secondary school, if you have that relationship, I think it should be okay for a student to be told, if you can't be bothered to do a decent first draft of this piece of work, I can't be bothered to give you any feedback on it. Sometimes you can do better than this might be the absolute best feedback, because the student knows that they didn't try and you know they didn't try. And sometimes it might be more helpful to call them on it and say, yeah, this is not your best work. You can do better than this. Have another go, and then I'll give you feedback. So it's, ultimately, it comes down to your judgment, your knowledge of your students. What kind of feedback can I give that's going to get me more of what I want? There is no other definition of good feedback than feedback. Good feedback gets you more of what you want from your students.
Thank you. Dylan, this question is around those short cycle checks for understanding that you spoke about at the start of your presentation. And the question speaks to the point that you make that one of the best uses of teacher time is to sit together in teams to develop those hinge questions that will allow us to collect the evidence to interpret whether students have met the learning intentions we set for them. The question is, when is it more effective to plan those frequent short cycle checks for understanding before the lesson versus developing them during the lesson in the moment in response to puzzled faces?
Well, I talk about hinge points, checkpoints in the lesson. For the experienced teacher, any point in the lesson is a checkpoint. They can make up really great questions. What I'm saying is that most teachers aren't there. And what I'm saying is that most teachers would benefit from having at least one strategically placed checkpoint in a lesson, because then you can actually make sure that the alternatives are good. You can actually make up a question on the spur of the moment, but it's not going to be a multiple choice question. So you might use a mini whiteboard, for example, but it still might be difficult to read 30 mini whiteboards. The reason I like multiple choice questions, I don't like them for tests, I love them for classroom teaching, because if you can actually reduce the options down to 4 or 5 options, then you've got a much simpler cognitive task as a teacher. You thought the answer was A. Can you tell us why? You thought the answer was A. Was that the same reason that John gave, or was it different? You thought the answer was B. So the idea of having these pre-prepared diagnostic questions that are all multiple choice in format pre-processes analysis that allows you to make simpler decisions in the classroom about what to do next. And so sometimes you might actually say, okay, well, almost all of you get it. Osman, I'm going to need to see you later. So you might actually decide that there's 3 kids who don't get it, and I'm going to go on, and I'm going to speak to those 2 students later. So it can often help you just very quickly parse the classroom into, here's what I'm going to do again with the whole class because they all got it wrong. Here's what I'm going to do with these 3 kids because they're at C. And so it's just keeping that process really simple. Don't try to use all the information you get. It's overwhelming. The 2 decisions are, what do I do again with the whole class? And are there any students who need one-to-one help to make sense of this? Keep it as simple as that. Don't make it any more complicated than that. You'll drive yourselves crazy.
Next question. When having students assess anonymous work of others, do you think it's better to show them only high-quality samples or a mix of low, medium and high?
I think it's a mix. One of the things you can actually ask them is to say, what's good about the good ones? So certainly, if I was, the example I gave was very specific, which is you give them a rubric, a scoring rubric, which might have 4 levels of achievement. I wouldn't give them a 4 or a 1. I'd give them a 2 or a 3. So they can actually see and then they have to think about what would make that 2 into a 3, what would make that 3 into a 4. So they have to engage with the rubric to work out what feedback to give to that anonymous student. On the other hand, I have also seen very effectively, I saw a nice example in a politics lesson with a year 12 class. They wrote an essay about checks and balances in the American political system. The teacher secretly gave each lesson essay a grade, but she then photocopied the 3 best ones and gave each student a copy of the 3 best essays. And then the next lesson, the class talked about why these essays were good. So the kids were looking at their own work and they could see a model of the other one, and they were encouraged to reflect on why do I think this piece of work is better than the piece of work that you did? And so that encouraged that reflection. And then the students got the grade. So the students had to actually comment on what was different about the high quality ones from their own work before they were given the grade that their work had got. So sometimes the best thing to do is to show high quality work. Sometimes it's just too much of a stretch for those students. So it's about judging those students and what's the next step for the student. Sometimes it's a big step, sometimes it's a small step. And nobody's in a better position than you are to judge that for your students.
Thanks, Dylan. The next 3 questions are actually really similar, and I think the observation that's been made in them are around the fact that here at St Peter's there can be a focus on kind of grade hunting behaviours amongst students and sometimes their parents as well, where there's a hyperfixation on the end result. How do we build a culture in the classroom and beyond that in the wider college where we are shifting that paradigm and students are focusing on the learning and the thinking and the process rather than just the right answer or the result?
I don't think we can ever get away from that, to be quite honest. And I'm not even sure it would be very desirable. So Carol Dweck and a number of other psychologists have talked about performance orientation versus learning orientation. Are the students interested in getting the highest grade, or are they interested in learning? And Carol Dweck and her colleagues tend to think that as a continuum. So students are at one end or other end of this continuum. But there's a psychologist named Elizabeth Linenbrink who has suggested that, in fact, these are at right angles to each other. In other words, the most successful students are both learning and performance-oriented. So, ultimately, if we have tests worth teaching to, if we have grades that really measure understanding, then the important thing we need to be saying to students is, yes, the grade that you get matters, but the feedback I'm going to give you is going to help you get a better grade. So the trap is that we give them grades all the time. And that, I think, is unhealthy. As Alfie Kohn says, grading stops the learning. Maybe not for very long, but grading always stops learning because you get that emotional reaction. So I think certainly, maybe once a term in the upper school, maybe once a year in the lower school. I don't think we should be giving students grades that often. We should be saying to them, yes, you'll get a grade at the end of this term or this semester, but during the term, the feedback I'm going to give you is to help you get a better grade at the end. And so, I think we have to accept the reality that parents want those grades, students want those grades, they need those grades for progression. But how do we make them work positively? I'm not against that. I'm not against exams and grades where the criteria are accessible to the students, because it focuses the system. It aligns everybody on the same thing. So just accept it. It's important to note, people always say, I'd love to teach in this way, but I have to raise my test scores. The randomized controlled trial I mentioned earlier on, in England, the outcome measure was the grades that those students got on the national school leaving examination in 8 subjects. So I've always worked in systems where schools are held accountable for the grades their students get. I know it's not as strong in Queensland as it is in New South Wales and Victoria, but formative assessment is the best way to raise scores on student accountability measures, provided we use it intelligently and say to the students, yes, there'll be a grade at the end of this sequence of learning, but during the learning episodes, we're going to focus on feedback that helps you get a better grade at the end.
I'm going to end on a really lovely practical one, and it's certainly a strategy that I've heard of many teachers here using, and that's cold calling. But then there's that concern around how can you implement it in ways that students don't feel they're being targeted or picked on?
So as I said, I think you do actually have to provide opt-out strategies, like Madeline Hunter's idea of a pen. Don't call on me for this question. I think the way you do it is also important. So with a student who's weak, rather than saying, what's the answer to this question, you might put up 2 questions and say, which of those 2 questions you think are going to be the hardest to answer? If a student says, don't know, you say, okay, well, if you don't know, I'll come back to you. Get 3 different answers from other members of the class and say, okay, now which of those answers do you like best? So it's about making sure that we don't put the student on the spot and have them fail. We might scaffold. So we might actually say, okay, if you can't make up an answer, can you choose between answers? But I think ultimately it comes down to this inclusion idea. You matter. You belong. You are a full member of this learning community. I just want to, if those are the last questions, I just want to spend some time on the final strategy, which is of students as owners of their own learning. And I think one of the things we have to stress here is getting students to evaluate their own work, maybe with a rubric, maybe with traffic lights, but I've mentioned the problems with those. Here's the big idea. We need to stress to our students that they're making progress. So you might not be the smartest kid in the class, but if we can find ways of signaling to our students they're making progress, then they will try their best. And one of the ways we can do that is with practice testing, as I mentioned earlier. Now, practice testing is one of the best evidenced classroom techniques in all of cognitive psychology. But students don't like tests. So one of the things that I've advocated is zero stakes testing. In other words, students work through a topic. You finish the topic? Good. Here's a test. Test yourself on this topic. Finish the test? Good. Here's the answers. Mark your own work. And don't tell me how you did unless you want to. Self-testing is so valuable, we have to rehabilitate classroom testing. We have to say to the students, look, there'll be a test on this content at the end of the term, but during the term, these tests are not for me, they're for you. They're to help you judge the progress that you are making. The reason I think this is so important is because now it's becoming clear that we can't teach students everything they need to know by the time they leave us. The world is changing so fast that the future is going to belong to the people who can carry on learning, because most of what they need for the rest of their lives hasn't been discovered or invented yet. So no matter how much we teach our students, no matter how much we manage to cram into their heads, if they leave the college alienated from learning, we fail them, because they won't be able to embrace the challenges that the new world will bring. So my goal is, yes, we need high levels of achievement, but we can't achieve that by narrowing the curriculum. And we need our 18-year-olds leaving us with the same passion and curiosity that they have when they start with us at the age of 5 or 6. So the goal is basically, that's why I think self-assessment, having students become agents of their own learning, is so powerful. Because if we can convince our students that effort creates ability, smart, in Jeffrey Howard's terms, smart is not something you just are. Smart is something you can get. You may not find this as easy as somebody else does, but there's no limit to what you can achieve if you put that effort in. Then I think we'll have created people who are able to embrace the challenges that they'll face once they leave school, knowing that, yes, it may be difficult, but if it's not making you struggle and think, it's probably not making you smarter. Lifting weights that aren't hard to lift doesn't make you stronger. Doing work that doesn't make you struggle doesn't make you smarter. If we can convince students of that, then I think all the pieces fall into place quite neatly.
Thank you so much for your time today, Dylan. There is no denying that Staff Week at St Peter's is a hectic one. Every single person in this room has been pretty much booked back to back. We are emergency trained, we have timetables, we have battled through Synergetic, we have had meetings in many departments, and as educators and as professionals,
we know that what gets us out of bed every morning and into a room full of stinky young people is that desire to do everything that we can in our time with them to improve their learning through the choices that we make. And that's what gives us energy and keeps us going when we're really busy. And there are a couple of things that I took from today that really energised me to do that. I think there is a reminder that I got today that it is the small, incremental, purposeful, evidence-based strategies that we use with discernment in our practice as professionals that get us good learning for our students. And I'm so looking forward to sharing some of these strategies and reflecting on our use of these strategies with my colleagues in my community of practice this term. And this has been a lovely launching point for that focus in our professional practice this term. And I'm very grateful for our time with Dylan today. Can you please join me in thanking him? I also just want to put a big shout out to our glorious events team, and particularly Andrew, who helped us to do all of this business today. And he is very excellently and skillfully going to make the live stream of this event shareable to everybody for those who missed it or want to review it as we lose energy, which sometimes happens. So please thank him and have a glorious day. Thank you so much for your time, colleagues.